And let us begin. We got Purim just a few days away. We talk about different concepts and ideas relating to Purim. Well, here's one that we talked about this in a different context in regards to a course we once did called Crime and Consequence. Some of you were here in those days, but not all of you. And in that case, we had a story, a very famous story that happened in New York in the 1960s called the case of Kitty Genovese. Let me put the video up here to tell you the story, and then we could discuss its relevance to the Purim story. So watch the story and we'll discuss.
If you saw someone actually being murdered, would you take action? Would you call the police or maybe try to get involved? These are the questions that the Kitty Genovese case has brought to the minds of anyone that hears about it. The story is a case of a roller coaster. It involves power relations, media sensationalism, and the actual establishment of the 911 system. It's most known for its connection to the bystander effect. Sometimes known as Genovese syndrome, the bystander effect has forced psychologists to take a hard look at how and when people make decisions about getting involved with conflict. But before we dive into about the bystander effect, this video is going to be talking about the Kitty Genovese case. So first of all, what happened to Kitty Genovese? At 3 in the morning on March 13th, 1964, Kitty Genovese walked home to her apartments in Queens. On the way, she was approached by William Mosley, who had been following her home. Mosley ran after Kitty, eventually caught up to her, and then stabbed her multiple times. She screamed for help, and a neighbor yelled towards Mosley to leave Kitty alone. Mosley quickly fled the scene, and Kitty ran to her apartment building. However, Mosley came back after a few minutes. He found Kitty lying in front of a door to the back of the apartment building. He stabbed her multiple times, stole some money, and ran away again. In total, she was stabbed over a dozen times, and the entire attack took place over 30 minutes, during which time multiple calls to the police were made. At 4:15 in the morning, Kitty died as she was being taken to the hospital. And a few days after the murder, Genovese's death did not receive much attention. It took a week for the police to find the murderer. In fact, they actually originally named Kitty's girlfriend as a suspect. So why has this case lived on as one of the most famous murders in America, 60 years after it happened? Well, this brings us to the New York Times story. Word got around to the staff at the New York Times about Kitty's murder. But the actual murder wasn't what interested editor Abe Rosenthal. It was the witnesses to the murder. Police had interviewed 38 people in their investigations. 5 of them gave testimony at the trial. 2 weeks after Kitty's murder, the New York Times published an article titled 37 Who Saw Murder But Didn't Call Police. The article took the nation by storm. Media outlets called it a failure, casting the city of New York into a dark light. People saw it as a failure of humankind, and many people called it a case of urban apathy. That same year, editor Abe Rosenthal published a book called 38 Witnesses. He called on us all to question how we act in the face of crime, and how the urban environment may impact our decisions. These questions still haunt many psychologists and academics today, and in fact, entire courses have been created based on this case. The search for answers has shaped the way many people look at decision-making and the way that they go about their life. But let's go back to a minute about the New York Times article. So the story's first paragraph reads, "For more than half an hour, 38 respectable, law-abiding citizens in Queens watched a killer stalk and stab a woman in 3 separate attacks in Kew Gardens." Later on it mentions, "Not one person telephoned the police during the assault. One witness called after the woman was dead." Wait a second, you might be saying. Didn't you say people actually called the police? Yes. In the 50 or more years that have passed since New York Times published this article, much criticism has come out against it. New details about the case have been revealed. That Kitty did not die alone, but in the arms of a friend. That multiple calls were made to the police before her death, and that some witness statements to the police were discarded because they already got the call. Certainly, 38 people did not see Kitty die. Of all 38 people interviewed by the police, many of them heard screams, looked out their window, saw nothing, and then went back to bed. The New York Times has gone back to review and correct information that was originally shared in the incorrect article. If you want to learn more about uncovering the facts of this case, I recommend that you watch The Witness. This documentary follows Kitty's brother, Bill Genovese, as he tracks down information on Kitty's life and her death. He talks to reporters involved in the case, witnesses who were shocked to learn that they were one of the 38, and other people involved. It was actually nominated for a News and Documentary Emmy Award in 2018. So the story put out by the New York Times wasn't entirely accurate, but the impact of the Kitty Genovese case and the story that soon came after it is true. Sociologists, psychologists, and journalists have spent the past 50 years researching the bystander effect and something else called the diffusion of responsibility, two phenomena in which people fail to act due to the amount of bystanders present. These phenomena seek to explain, "I thought you were going to do something about it," or "I didn't want to get involved." The case is also one of the reasons that the 911 system was put in place. Before Kitty's death, you could only call the operator and then ask to be connected to the local police station, or you could call the station's number directly. 3 years later, federal agencies put in a plan to create the 911 system as we know it is today. The first 911 call was made in 1968. Now, there's a lot of stories within this one case. There's a story of a witness who did fail to call the police. There's a story of a falsely reported article that went on to be sensationalized in the media. And there's a story of how we as people react to the idea of the bystander effect and the diffusion of responsibility. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any questions about the bystander effect or the Kitty Genovese case, feel free to leave them in the comments below, or stay tuned for my next video all about specifically the bystander effect and the research that has been done to support the idea. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.
Okay, then.
If you saw someone actually being murdered, would you take action? Would you call the police or maybe...
All right, you saw that already. The story, although there's a lot of detail to it, and you could see that much later on, there was a different analysis to the story that maybe not all 38 of these people actually witnessed the assault. So yes, there's more detail to it than the article portrayed, but it's still a good question. And in fact, this story is used as an introduction to psychology courses because this phenomenon of what's my responsibility? Do I need to do anything? Do I need to say anything? Do I need to get involved? Am I my brother's keeper? Is a question that is there nonetheless, even if not all the details of the article in the New York Times was accurate. So there were, whether there was a dozen witnesses or dozens of witnesses, the fact is many people did not get involved. Many people didn't do anything. And this is just an example of such a story. It's a famous story. That's why we used the video of it, because I wanted to use a video of something that people are familiar with, and there's an actual video of the story. But there's many such stories that happen all over the world, including right here in Johannesburg, all of the time. And that's the question. What responsibility do I have towards others? Do I have a responsibility? Am I required to assist others in their time of need? Now, some ethicists are of the opinion, let's just put this part here, right? This is what some people said. I saw part of the attack, but I didn't call the police. I don't want to mix it. I don't have to get involved. And this is a question that a lot of people ask, and a very famous biblical verse, Cain. I have to tell you my joke goes always. You know, if I walk with a cane, one of my old friends said to me, he asked me the question. I answered the one, because I'm not able. Very good. You've heard it from me before. So, am I my brother's keeper is the question that God asks of Cain, after his notorious evasion of responsibility after doing a job on his brother. But I think it's a question we all need to ask. And here is an interesting, let me just see if I put it in there. You know, I started putting the texts in and I realized I won't have the time to put all the texts in. So I took most of the texts out, maybe all the texts out. So I just need to see which texts made it in. The first question we're asking is, am I my brother's keeper? And I want to start off with an ethicist by the name of Dr. Eliezer Ben Shlomo. And he puts this in a journal in which he discusses this. Okay, so let's see the difference between a secular approach versus a religious Jewish approach. He says Western jurists do not believe that a person can be made to act positively in order to rescue someone else. Quoting Hall, I don't know who Hall is, I guess a famous ethicist. Hall explains, we do not believe that every man must be his brother's keeper. Okay, so that, pardon? Hall, no, this is not Hillel. Hillel says, yes, we are. Don't do to others what you want to do to yourself. If God forbid you were in a position where your life was at stake, God forbid, it shouldn't happen to any of us. But theoretically speaking, what would you want someone else to do? That's what Hillel says. Hillel says what's hateful unto to others do not do. But Hall, who is a secular ethicist, Hall's approach is, we don't believe that every man must be his brother's keeper. I don't have to get involved. Okay? Now, we of course saw this in the case of Cain in the Torah. The real issue is not that he did not act in order to save his brother. Exactly, his brother cried out to God. So he actually acted to murder him. So it's a very different kind of case to compare with. But apparently somehow imagining that God wasn't omniscient, right? Cain feigned ignorance. He pretended. By the way, this is why our sages tell us why God asks him. You think God didn't know what he did? God asks him, Ayeh Hevel Achicha. Where is Hevel, your brother? But God doesn't know where Hevel is. Of course God knows. But our sages tell us, you come into a house, knock, knock. Don't just jump on somebody. I know what you did. Give them a chance. Like, do things pleasantly. So just to think about this. Do we have a responsibility for the whereabouts, for the welfare of another? Again, in Cain's case, he actively murdered his brother, and yet God is asking him, where is Hevel, your brother? We're all responsible for one another. That's a Jewish perspective. But the secular perspective says, live and let live. It's not my business. I don't interfere, whatever it is, as long as my life is okay. What do I care is going on in someone else's? So there's no question regarding the immorality of Cain's behavior. He murdered his brother. He has to be brought to justice. But there's also no denying that the defense he offers, okay, saying, am I my brother's keeper? That's what he says. That we all understand that it's good to help others. We all know that we should act beneficently. Yes, love your father as yourself. But the question I'm asking is there a moral obligation? That's my question. Should a person be required to help someone else in need? Right? Let's say you're driving along the highway on the M1 here, and you see that a motorcyclist has, God forbid, crashed into the lane divider. I saw that myself recently. Do you have an obligation to pull over and call for help? Do you? There's hundreds of motorists driving by. You have to be the one to interfere, to do something. You can get killed. So we have good reasons and excuses why we shouldn't get involved. Okay, let me pose another question. God forbid a child falls into a swimming pool or into the ocean. You know how to swim. I don't. You know. Okay, because it's different. If you don't know how to swim, then you actually are risking your own life. I'm talking about where you're not risking your life. Because Mr. Katz is saying that if there is a risk to your life, that you're going to pull over on the side of the road, there was an incident that happened here, in fact. I don't remember the details, but I do remember an incident where somebody pulled over to the side of the road to help someone else, and then they got killed or badly injured. Yeah. So you have to be careful in how you can't risk your own life to save another. I mean, using the case of the pool or the sea, it actually happened right here in our community in December, where a young man who I was previously his neighbor, Davi Hochstetter, he saw his child fall into the water, and he went to rescue his child. Miraculously, his child was rescued, and he wasn't, sadly. Very sad. And there was a Rebbitzin in St. Thomas just a few months ago, and I do want to try to keep this element of, okay, let's try to keep it, but let's try to keep it as interactive but civil at the same time. The point is, we've had a few cases just recently in the community where we've seen there the mother and the child lost their lives, sadly, one in St. Thomas. And here, Davi, who's a friend of mine, he lost his life, and his child's life was saved. Using these scenarios, we see this real life cases. So certainly, if you don't know how to swim, you definitely shouldn't jump in. Now you do know how to swim. Do you have a responsibility to go in? What if there's stormy conditions? I believe in Dovi's case, he knew how to swim, but the water, I don't know, there was some major waves and what was it? Okay, there's riptide, God forbid. So you don't know what's going to happen. Do you have an obligation to put yourself at risk? Now, listen, it was his own child. And the Rebbitzin in St. Thomas, it was her own child. Any parent would do anything to save their child, right? So if it's a stranger, you should save anyone's life. But to what extent? Do you do it? Do you risk your life to save someone else's? Now, while these are all moral and ethical questions that are worthwhile to ask in the case of a car accident or in the case of the swimming of a riptide, these are real cases that we know happened here in our own community not too long ago. Let's not get stuck over here, because these are moral, ethical dilemmas that are probably impossible to really truly answer. We see that in both of these cases, unfortunately, the people who jumped in did not survive in very sad situations. The reason I introduce today's share with this story, 3 stories really, the Kitty Genovese case, where nobody interceded, nobody helped out, and these 2 hypothetical scenarios, is because in the Purim story, this dilemma finds expression in one of the Megillah's most dramatic moments that we read yesterday, the day before Shir, that we touched upon, but that's why I was inspired to go and do this class, is because we didn't really get into this topic. In a sense, the scene is the pivotal point of the entire Purim story, because we read the Purim story after 3 chapters of dramatic buildup of the Purim story. Everything's in place. Remember, the foolish king Achashverosh, he murdered his first wife at the behest of his best friend, and then he takes his friend out at the advice of his second wife. A little bit of a confused man. But putting that aside, Esther wins the beauty pageant. She becomes the new queen, and now she is in this privileged position where she is the one who's able to save her nation, right? So she wins the beauty contest. She's the Persian queen, and Haman is putting into place this plot, this conspiracy against the Jews. And in fact, it was signed and sealed. And as was pointed out yesterday, well, I didn't point it out, but I'll point it out today, that in Persian rule, the rules of Persia and Media, correct? A edict that was issued by the king is binding and cannot be revoked. So therefore, in this case, the king couldn't rescind this order that the Jews should be murdered. The only thing he was able to do was to declare a new order that the Jews can defend themselves. Imagine, without the king's consent and endorsement, they wouldn't be able to defend themselves. They would just have to be lame ducks ready to be killed. Well, at least they were able to defend themselves. And we could see the anti-Semitism, the hatred that many of the Persians still went and tried to kill Jews. And we had to defend ourselves, stand up for ourselves. Well, thank God a lot has changed since then. But let's get into a certain part of the story in the Megillah, and let's see what happens when Esther is asked by her cousin or uncle Mordechai to intercede. When I told the story Monday, Tuesday, we jumped straight to the part where she actually tells Mordechai, go gather the Jews, fast, don't eat, don't drink, just pray for 3 days, and I will do the same. But if you pay attention in the Megillah story, it doesn't happen that easy and that quick. She's a little bit reluctant at first. And while her reluctance appears to be as if she, and remember I told you there's a faribel between her and Mordechai, it looks like she doesn't want to jump at it right away. She wants to protect her own image. That is not really the case. But this is where we want to analyze the Megillah story and understand why it looks like, it appears that she doesn't want to help out. What was her theory? What was her thinking? That's what I want to look at. Yes. Yes, it appears like she threatens her. Let's look at that story. I'm going to pull up the Megillah. Let's look at that part of the story. And then we'll get back to this preface that we gave today as a way to better understand the story. Fair enough? I'm going to read the Megillah to you. Any questions you'll do right after that. Tikra Esther Lasach. Esther summoned Asach. Who was Asach? He was Misarisei Hamelech. He was one of the king's chamberlains. Okay? Asher Ha'amid Lefaneha, who had been appointed before her. And what did she do? Vatitzaveh Mordechai. She commanded him concerning Mordechai. And she wants to know what this was and why this was. So she's curious what's happening. Don't forget, she's very privileged. She lives in Achashverosh's palatial mansion, and imagine you're living in Buckingham Palace. You really don't know what's going on outside. You don't get WhatsApps. You don't get to see all the messages. It's a different life. Now Mordechai says, listen, I want you, Esther, to know is kol asher karahu, everything that's going on. And all this money, remember, when Haman tried to persuade King Ahasuerus into annihilating the Jewish nation, he used a two-pronged approach. One was claiming that the Jews are a fifth column, are a thorn in his side, they're disloyal, they are not committed to the nation, they're trying to usurp it, all these different stories that a suspicious and paranoid King Ahasuerus would buy into. But he also used a financial incentive. He told Ahasuerus, don't worry about the tax gap. I'll fill it in. And I'll take care of the cost of the extermination. Right? Costs money to exterminate a nation, to build gallows and concentration camps. I need to tell you a story. I'm sorry, I am digressing for a moment, because you have to see God's plan. And in life, we sometimes don't realize it. And the Megillah itself that I'm reading to you from right now does not mention God's name anywhere. Why? In fact, Esther's name means Hester. Esther, Hester. It means hidden. That means God is hidden in the story. Yes, God's there. And in life, sometimes we don't see God. Yesterday, I was being Menachem Aviv. I went to comfort a man, a friend of mine, whose father passed away. He's in Shiva this week. And I knew his father, and we were sitting there and talking, and this man shared with me a story that he read. And actually, he says you could watch a video. I think he's going to send me the link when he gets a chance. So if he does, I'm happy to send it to you. The man himself. There's a rabbi in Los Angeles. I think Los Angeles. Maybe he said London. I don't remember. London, Los Angeles. What difference does it make where it was? He sees a particular yid, an old man, who davens and saying Kaddish. So he asks him, do you have yortzeit today? The man says, no, I don't have yortzeit for an immediate relative. I have yortzeit for a close friend. Really? Who's this friend? Tell us. You're saying Kaddish for him. Let us know. Usually if you see somebody who doesn't ordinarily say Kaddish, right? Person says Kaddish in the year of mourning, and then on a yortzeit. So he's a member or a congregant. He's an old man that comes to the shul. He's saying Kaddish. Tell us whose yortzeit it is. We'll say L'chaim. So he says it's the yortzeit of his friend. Who is his friend? He said, this is my best friend. And he and I grew up together, said in Poland or wherever they were, somewhere in Europe. And this man says, I was always a believer. Every day I'd put on tefillin. And my friend was a little bit of more of a skeptic, less believing. And we always had arguments and debates with each other. And anything in life, I always had a motto from the Talmud, which is Yeshuas Hashem Keheref Ayin. God's salvation can always come with the blink of an eye. Anyways, unfortunately, they were both put in cattle cars and they were sent to Auschwitz. And constantly throughout their journey, this best friend of his, they were young men, teenagers, this best friend of his would always ask him, you still believe? Look what we're going through. Look what we're enduring. He said, I have the strongest faith and belief in God. And even in the cattle car he'd put on his tefillin, this man always had a strong belief. Sadly, when they got to Auschwitz, the tefillin was confiscated. And his friend asks him, do you still believe? So Yeshua, Hashem, Keheref Ein. I believe in God's salvation. It could come with a blink of an eye. And this skeptical friend always asking these questions, but this is the way they were. They were buddies. Everything was confiscated for them. He says, I was left with my belief, and my friend was left with his skepticism. And he said they were going through a hard time in the labor camp. And now they were all sent into the gas chamber. And they knew what was coming. And his friend turned to him and said, do you still believe we're here in a gas chamber? They're going to turn on the shower in a moment, and that's it. We'll be done. And he said, I turned to my friend and I said, I believe God's salvation could come the blink of an eye. And his friend said, you're crazy. I can't believe it. And believe it or not, the man says, obviously I'm here, right? After my friend asked me this, we were naked. We were getting ready for the showers to turn on. Gas. And the door opened. And a Nazi stormed in, said, I need one man for a job. And he points his finger at me. My friend looked at me in disbelief. And he said, you convinced me. I believe. Please say Kaddish for me on my yard site on this day. Every year I say Kaddish for my friend and for all those who perished that day in the gas chamber. But my life was saved. My belief took me all the way through this. This man, there's a video of it because he was interviewed and told the story on a show called The Shmooze. It's a weekly show by a man named Rabbi Schaefer. He lives in Monsey, New York, and he interviewed interesting people. He has a program called The Shmooze, and he interviewed this man, and this man told the story. It's an unbelievable story. And I'm sure when you hear it in his words, I didn't. He was going to send me the link. I'm sure it's a lot more meaningful hearing it from the man who this story happened to. Of course, there are people who question, how could that story? That's the story the man says. So just to see that even in these most difficult instances, God has a plan. I'll tell you one more story just to illustrate this. That again, I heard the story yesterday. This man was telling me he was gone through challenges in his life and was relating to me that if you believe, if you think everything is random, then everything in your life will appear to be random. But if you believe in the hand of Hashem, then God will be present in your life and you will see God's presence in your life. And this man at the Shiva home was telling me that despite all of those challenges that he went through, he says he sees God's hand in every aspect of his life. But emunah, bitachon, belief, and faith takes work. Second story. During the early days of COVID, there was a woman in Israel who needed to make a bar mitzvah for her son. Unfortunately, the boy's father couldn't be at the bar mitzvah because he just died of COVID. And now this woman was devastated. She didn't know what to do. Here she's making a bar mitzvah for her son. You can imagine a COVID bar mitzvah, just a few people. In Israel, they were a little bit more breaking of the laws than they were, than here. And she prepared a bar mitzvah for her son, just a small crowd. And she was just thinking, who could give my son, who could substitute, fill the gap of his father not being present, think of a plan. And she decided to reach out to a particular singer, a singer in Israel, a renowned singer. She calls this singer up. She got his number. She says, listen, I have a request to make of you. I know it's not easy, and maybe other people ask you, but she describes the situation. She lost her husband. The child going up for getting a bar mitzvah. There's nobody to be there at his side. I was hoping that a celebrity like you being at his side will boost his morale. Would you mind coming to his bar mitzvah and being there with him? And the singer says, with pleasure. And here's the singer, superstar in Israel, comes to the bar mitzvah. Not only is he present with this kid to go up to the Torah with him, but he sings, performs, he really gives this kid a bakava bar mitzvah to make him feel special on his big day. Very good. The man didn't charge a cent, a recently orphaned child. The next day, he gets a phone call from the mother of the bar mitzvah boy. She says, I want to thank you for what you did. Incredible. But I also have some news to tell you. Somebody at the bar mitzvah tested positive for COVID. I just want to let you know, just in case you want to get tested or you're feeling symptoms. So sorry to let you know this. Well, the man, knowing he might have some other gigs to attend, not that there were that many gigs during COVID, but trying to eke out a living, he goes to get tested. And guess what? Tested positive. And now he's isolated at home for the next 10 days or whatever it was, maybe even 2 weeks back then. And he's feeling like a little bit demoralized. Here he did a mitzvah. He went and helped this child for no cost. And it comes back to bite him. No good deed goes unpunished. He's really not feeling good about this. And quite disappointed. How could God do this to him? How could it be that for doing a mitzvah, for helping someone else out, he gets COVID? Now he can't do other gigs. He had to cancel anything else out. And he just wasn't feeling good about it. He felt like he was being punished for a good act that he did. Well, 2 weeks later, he gets a phone call. The phone call is from an organization in America. This organization says, we heard about your mitzvah that you did for that bar mitzvah boy, how you were there for him, for this orphan, and you stood there with him at his aliyah, and you sang for him at the little ceremony and party they did for him. We were so touched by this story. This is an organization in America that makes bar mitzvahs for orphaned children who cannot, don't have fathers for themselves. But it's an organization that's financial backing. And this organization said to him, we have a sponsorship of $100,000 plus your airfare and any other costs involved to fly you from Israel to America. You'll get paid $100,000 to sing at this bar mitzvah for orphan children like you did last week, 2 weeks ago, whatever it was. Amazing, wow. But there's one catch, one caveat. Caveat is, because we're having so many people at this bar mitzvah, nobody could attend this bar mitzvah without a proof of, I don't think the vaccination was out yet, so they needed a proof that they recently had tested positive for COVID and had recovered from it. You'll need a letter from your doctor, from your physician, to prove that you had had COVID, you tested positive, and you recovered. Now, a few days ago, this superstar singer is at home thinking, "Oy, how could it be? How could God do this to me? I do a kind act, and now I get punished." Huh? He's getting paid $100,000. He's able to prove that he recently had COVID, recovered from it, and he'll get paid far better than he would in Israel for any performance he would have done. Just to see God's hand. And here is where we have to actually understand the story of the Megillah as it unfolds. And Esther, living in the palace, she doesn't know what's going on. But the verses in the Megillah tell us that Mordechai informs her about the decree, about the impending annihilation, the final plan that was put in place for the Jewish people. And we know what's happening. Mordechai now is begging Esther. She is in a privileged position to go to her husband, to King Achashverosh. And although until now she was to hide her identity, now is her chance to help out, to do something. But let's see what happens. Esther responds through this messenger Hasach to go back to Mordechai. And she says, you should know, everyone knows that any man or woman who comes to the king without the king's invitation, what's going to happen? Execution is their destiny if they come without an invitation, without the king extending his sharvit hazahav, his golden scepter. If you don't do that, you won't live. Va'ani, yet I, was not invited to the king already in 30 days. Maybe I've already lost favor in his eyes. Who knows? Now, things are just not that simple in the royal Persian court. That's what Esther's telling Mordechai. You don't just simply rock up and walk into the king's chamber whenever you feel like it. Even the queen has to be summoned and invited. And yet I have not been invited for a month already. So I'm just going to surprise visit the king. Who knows what he'll do to me? Now, yet Mordechai doesn't buy into this, right? He feels that Esther's being indifferent, that Esther is not doing the right thing. Okay? Esther says, I haven't been summoned. And Mordechai responds, at this critical moment, you should be willing to risk your life. Going back to our discussion before, what are you willing to risk your life for? We'll bring that back in a moment. Esther saying, if I go, I'm putting my life at risk. Okay? So Mordechai is not impressed with Esther's response. What does Mordechai say back to Esther? Anyone remember? He says, do not imagine to yourself that you, misprivileged Esther, will in any way escape from the king's house when they come for the Jews. You know how certain Jews felt in Germany in the 1930s? We're different. We're privileged. We have friends in high places. We won't be susceptible to the Germans harming us. We're more German than the Germans, some of them felt. I'm not comparing that to Esther, but you could see a similarity. I guess I am comparing it to Esther, but not, meaning I'm not trying to make the same parallel. Esther was righteous, and as we'll see in a moment, what her claim was. But I want you to put it into context and understand the perspective of how Mordechai sees it. Some people felt that maybe they were nobility, maybe they were more privileged, maybe they were more secular, maybe it didn't help any Jews in Germany. Didn't help them in any way, right? So Mordechai comes back with a very harsh response, and that's what you were referring to before Tzipporah. He says, Ki machareish tacharishi ba'eis hazais. For if you remain silent in this time when you are needed, Mordechai says to Esther, then you know something? Okay, you stay shtum. You don't use your connections. Then guess what? Salvation and rescue will come for the Jews. Mimakom acher, from another place. And you and your whole family, your whole household will perish. Harsh words, he says. And now he throws in a kicker. Nothing better than Jewish guilt. Who even knows? You think you were chosen because you're so pretty, because you're so charming. Huh? Is this not the reason why you were selected as the queen? To be the one who would be in this privileged position to help save the Jews? And guess what? Right after he uses this apparently threatening words, or we could give it a different, call it not threatening, but isn't it a little bit of a blackmail? Seems like. Very stern response from Mordechai. And is Esther moved by it? Is she? Yes, absolutely. Suddenly she's up for the challenge. She develops a plan of action and she asks that you pray and fast as we went through yesterday, right? So all of a sudden, she buys into it and she's prepared to pay the ultimate sacrifice, to put her life at risk to help the Jews. And that's when she says, Lech knesses kol hayudim, go gather all the Jews and fast. And so what happens? And she even says, here are the words of Mordechai threatening her, so to say. And now she says, Uvechein avoy al hamelech, and indeed, I'll go to the king. Fine, no problem. Even if I'm uninvited. And if I will perish, so I will perish. You hear this? She's saying, before she's saying she's reluctant, remember, the king hasn't invited me in 30 days. Afraid. Now she's saying, okay, I'm going. And if I die, I die. I'm willing to put my life at risk. What's going on here? Right? If Esther really had deep reservations, the king hasn't invited me in 30 days. How can I help? He might just execute me too, like he did with his first wife, with Vashti. You know, there's rules here. So how did Mordechai's threats help here? That she and her family would die if she didn't do anything. And help would come from elsewhere. What's going on? You would expect a woman of Esther's righteousness that right away she would be motivated by altruism, not a threat, not just self-preservation. Remember, he says, if you don't go, well, guess what? Someone else will. It will come from elsewhere. What's going on here? How did she get convinced at this stage where she wasn't before? What changed? So let me share with you an explanation that's brought by the Malbim. Malbim is a very great commentary on many areas of Jewish teachings. And the Malbim says as follows. By the way, whenever I mention the Malbim, I love a vort of his. The Malbim once said, you know, there's King Solomon mentions that like Kol's man va'et, there's a time and a place for everything. Eight lehov, eight lisno, a time for love, a time for hate, a time for peace, a time for war, a time to laugh, a time to cry. For each one of these, says the Malbim, there's one in between. There's always, sometimes you're not laughing, you're not crying. Sometimes you're not speaking, but you're not sorry. That's the one he didn't understand. Sometimes you're not at war, but you're not at peace. So, but what about, he says there's a time to speak and a time to remain silent. Very relevant here, that Esther shouldn't be silent. She should speak up. So the insight that I liked that he said was, he says there was a Rav who came to his shul and he gave a whole speech. Sometimes I feel like I'm that guy. And he said, Gerät and gerät, aber gar nicht gesagt. You know what that means? Spoke and spoke, but said nothing. You ever hear such preachers and teachers? Our president is like that, okay. So sometimes the rabbi gets up, talks. But what did he say? Do you have a vort to bring home? Oh, am I in trouble now? I hope I don't do that to you. I hope that after a shir every day, you could come home with something, some inspiration, some motivation. Hopefully. Anyways, says the Malbim, Hash'ela Yosef Nifla. This is a most astonishing question. How was Esther not prepared to risk her life when she heard that the Jewish people were under threat of destruction, annihilation, obliteration? Where was she? And her explanation that I haven't been called to the king says that's not a good excuse, right? Surely there has to be more to Esther's argument than just that I haven't been called in 30 days. Now, it's possible to understand the conversation between Esther and Mordechai as hinging on the same ethical question that we asked at the beginning of our class today. What's the question? Should a person risk their own life? That's the question. Should a person be willing to risk their life in order to save somebody else? That's the question. And obviously, it's an ethical and moral dilemma. And it's a question that is not only in the Kitty Genovese case, but we all have that question at all times. And it's a question that Esther faced that day. And this dilemma, I want to look at it from the lens of halacha and just to understand what is our personal duty and destiny. And that is where Mordechai comes in with his, so to say, threat to her and can help us try to understand how to deal with and how to relate this question when we are faced with the same dilemma. And our commentaries tell us that actually this was the faribel, the argument, the debate. It was was an issue of timing, okay? They were discussing two different time frames and they had to come to understand each other. So let's look at it. Mordechai insisted that Esther has to approach the king when? Immediately, now, go right away. No time to waste, it's critical. But Esther, as we saw, she's a clever woman, right? So don't just condemn her. Esther had a different strategy. She was advocating for a more measured, deliberate approach. That was Esther's idea. She hasn't seen the king for already a month, remember, right? If she would just burst into his chambers, she felt that would be rash and irresponsible. She knew, she said, I understand this man better than you do. I live with him. I know him intimately. Why risk upsetting the king, right? And then we are scuttling our best hope for rescue, for salvation for the Jews. Instead, her approach was, let's try something else. Esther was simply in favor of waiting to see if the king would call her himself, right? He hasn't invited me for 30 days. Maybe he's just about to call me. Maybe he's hungry. Distance makes the heart grow fonder. Maybe he just needs to see me. I need to charm him a bit, right? So either way, she feels there's no need to rush things. And this is an aspect of the Megillah that often goes unnoticed, is that the story actually unfolds in slow pace. In fact, the first few chapters, I believe, take place over 15-year time span. So it's not like overnight, Haman just wakes up, says, let's exterminate the Jewish people. This is something that took time to unfold, right? He's enraged, he's angered, the Jews don't worship him. All these things, it's a buildup. So Haman's plot, actually, from the time Mordechai informs Esther about this, it's 11 months away from the final solution taking place. So Esther thinks, well, if now, remember, this is Nisan. It's Purim time. And Adar is still 11 months away, right? So there's still time to work things through. And in fact, the Vilna Gaon understands Mordechai and Esther's argument in a very different way. Let me share with you how the Vilna Gaon said. The Vilna Gaon said, remember, Esther said that it won't be effective. She's saying, I don't want to rush into him. He hasn't called me in 30 days. So it won't be effective for me to just rock up on his door. Let us just deal with this. Mordechai says, rush in there. Esther says, let's strategize. Let's have a plan. This time, there's 11 months to go. Says the Vilna Gaon, it won't be effective if I go in right away. It's just going to ruin things, right? Because it's known. What did she quote? We quote from the Megillah. Any person who comes into the king's inner chamber unsummoned, what will happen? There's one law for them. Put to death. Execution. Yes, except if he stretches out a scepter. That's right. So that being the case, why should I risk rattling things up? Let's just, So the point is, let's take our time. Let's think of a plan. Yet Mordechai says, who knows whether at a time like this you will attain the kingdom. Another way of understanding that verse is what Rashi says. Who knows if the king will desire you next year at the time of the massacre? Meaning, another way of understanding this verse is that what's Mordechai saying to her? If this whole discussion is a disagreement of call it diplomatic strategy, then the first part, right, Mordechai's answer seems very inappropriate, right? What does he say? You think, don't imagine yourself. Let's put that screen back up here. If you think you're going to be silent at this time, that salvation would come from elsewhere. Hold on, we have 11 months. What's Mordechai getting all excited about? If Esther only wanted to wait for a more opportune time to approach her husband, then why does he accuse her of trying to escape if there's still 11 months to go? Right? Why does he lambast her so blisteringly? Why does he speak so harshly to her? Such a strong rebuke. So well, if there's 11 months to go, well, does Esther not have a point that we should just strategize a bit? She's saying, let's not rush. And yet Mordechai responds, if you don't do something now, you will perish. Someone else will have to do it. And now she gets excited. So there has to be more to this discussion between Esther and Mordechai. And the Malbim therefore says, she answered him with two arguments. First of all, if she enters the king's chambers now, she could be in danger, right? And if so, then she won't be able to achieve the whole plan. If the intended goal of pleading is that she should plead for her people, how's she going to be able to do that, right? So there's a much broader issue here that actually has to be considered. Esther's argument was really this ethical, halachic dilemma, this debate about the extent of one's duty to their people. Esther saying, I haven't been summoned, right? Mordechai is getting very testy with her. He has a very harsh response. And he says, if you don't do it now, right? But this is all back to that same dilemma we're discussing. Is there a moral obligation to help somebody else in need? If her argument is that she'll be in danger, right? If her life is in danger, that is not going to work. If I can't swim and I jump in to save somebody, do I really achieve anything? First of all, God forbid I become a victim now, and I won't even be able to help the other person. So Esther's point then is that if she's risking her own life, then the plan won't even work. So why is Mordechai telling her, threatening her, that you'll perish? So we have to, let me point out that generally, the civil authorities that we live under have, I don't think they make it an obligation. I don't know the law. There are good Samaritan laws, as we know, right? But secular law is more concerned with rights than it is with duties. Judaism is about responsibilities. Civil society is about your rights and protecting your rights. People are born with certain fundamental, unalienable rights. Is that what they call it? Like liberties. And we, of course, we only submit ourselves to the authority of the state in order to safeguard those rights and freedoms that we should have. And therefore, maybe if I want to help somebody else, is there an obligation? Law generally won't say so. You have a right, and we won't encroach on other people's freedoms and well-being. So in simple terms, the state will prevent its citizens from harming each other, but cannot force them to do something on behalf of each other. Now, for the most part, if you were to witness a crime or somebody in danger what would the law say? Do you have to intervene? Do you? Maybe some countries today might require it, but for the most part, using the US as an example, it's about your rights. But that's where Judaism differs. Judaism is about responsibility. I just had a Hatzalah training the other day, and they were telling us about our rules and regulations. Here in South Africa, the rule is do not do harm. Don't harm another. As a paramedic, it's very interesting, the rules, because as Good Samaritan, actually, you don't have to do anything. You would be a Good Samaritan. There would be laws to protect you if you stopped on the highway to help someone else out. But a paramedic actually has to do something. Yes. Now, yes, you have a responsibility and a duty. But the law, we were getting into very interesting complex laws on Monday nights in our training. And one of the laws is do not do harm. Actually, whatever you're doing, don't do harm. Yes. Okay, so that's what I'm teaching. All right, thank you. That's the point. There's rights and there's obligations. Civil society says there are laws. You have the laws that are to protect your rights, and Judaism tells us that we have responsibilities, and that's a big difference between rights and between obligations and between rights and obligations. Okay, Judaism is about the obligations. So here, let's understand where our duty, our responsibility comes in. According to the law, you have no responsibility to stop and help somebody on the way. Now, pardon? As Jews, you do. But this was a major debate in Israeli law, in the late 90s. In Israel's Knesset, there was a law that was dubbed the Chok Lo Ta'amod Adam Re'echa. The Torah tells us, Lo Ta'amod Adam Re'echa, which means do not stand by the shedding of your fellow's blood, right? In the Torah. Very clearly, a verse. We're going to read it in a couple of weeks' time. So the halacha, as it's explained in Jewish law, says whenever a person could save another person's life, but you fail to do so, you know something? You have just transgressed this law. Do not stand idly by the blood of your brother. So you're walking by an incident. Civil society will protect you and say you didn't have to do anything. But Jewish law says you just transgressed the law because you should have been there to help someone else. And the Gemara says this applies when you see somebody drowning, when you see somebody attacked by beast or human. Now, you hear, the halacha talks about, you hear about villains, but it goes into a lot of details about how this law is applied. But what about, yes, you have a responsibility to help someone else. What about if you are going to risk your own life? Does that law still stand? So we see a difference between Jewish law and secular law. Jewish law is saying that when it comes to saving someone else's life, you still have a responsibility to save someone else's life. The question is, what about if it's risking your own life? Pardon? Okay, a very famous moral dilemma. You have one bottle of water that you brought on this trip in the desert. Your friend was foolish and finished his bottle of water already. Do you have to share the water with them? Yes, no, we have two different opinions here. It's actually a debate in the Gemara. And the Gemara actually says you don't have to. But it's a different law. Where chayecha kodma, meaning your life, you have to be there to help, to save someone else. You won't have a life to help save another if you don't drink it yourself. Like on the airplane where they tell you, put the mask on yourself, the oxygen mask, before you put it on the person next to you, right? So the way Judaism sees things is that there's more to life than just live and let live, which is a very typical societal thing. God calls on us to lead a purposeful existence, to create societies that are not just peaceable, but also civilized, productive, and ultimately godly. And so On an individual level, this means that we not only bear negative responsibilities, don't do harm to others, as we were told in our course this week as paramedics, don't harm another, just don't cause harm, don't do. Jewish law says you have to proactively do something. So if you go back to the Kitty Javanese case that we started at the beginning of our shiur today, there's no doubt that the Torah's perspective, that any one of those neighbors who witnessed her assault had the unequivocal responsibility to assist her by calling the authorities, by calling the police, by doing something. Yes? Yeah, definitely there's a mitzvah that you should proactively go and help that person. That's what the Torah is saying. Don't stand by the spilling of your friend's blood. See something, say something, do something. You can't swim, alert others, do something. So back to this case, there certainly would be an obligation biblically to do something about it. What's that? Absolutely. The question is, of course, what if your own life would be at risk? That's the question. And that's the thing that we have to understand. When there's a life at risk, it's a different story. Would you still have that responsibility? And I mentioned in the past, there was a case in Israel where there was, do you remember there was I think it was in Australia, I don't remember, the Maccabiah game, there was a bridge that collapsed and people fell into the water, and there were a lot of people that died, and they didn't die actually from the bridge collapse. They died from the contamination in the water. Pardon? Was that a life bomb? No, I'm talking about I think it's a different story, not the Lag BaOmer story, a different one. Anyways, there's multiple examples of cases similar to this. The idea was that people fell into this water. What is that? It's in Tel Aviv. There's a famous, yeah, exactly. The Yarkon River, exactly. So recently, there was another case where there was a Tel Aviv, there was an Israeli athlete who was, I think she was on a boat, she was rowing, and she had some kind of a and she fell into, and she fell unconscious, and somebody jumped into the water and saved her life, actually. Right now, many people would have been reluctant to jump into that water, because in the previous years, when those Australian athletes died, not by drowning, but from the infections and the fungus and whatever the contamination case was of that water. So this guy here had a calculation to make when he jumped into that water to save this athlete's life. Is he risking his life? There's contamination. Actually, we have that question right now. People are saying that there's contamination in Johannesburg water. Hatzalah actually says it's a false representation, and the water is not contaminated. You don't have to worry, but people are worried. Okay, somebody messaged me yesterday, should you still not at least inform the community because maybe there's contamination? And my response to them was, Hatzalah sent out a message, the water is not contaminated, and you can drink Johannesburg water. It's fine. Yeah.
It might be that the river water is contaminated, and the health department says don't drink river water.
Yeah.
Tap water is.
Anyways, it's a good idea to filter your water regardless.
That's for heavy metals.
Right. Yeah. Yes, Ellie. Yeah. Okay, he was risking his life. Absolutely. Yeah. So look, the case of these in Israel, or any case that you want to mention, question is where there's no risk to life, for sure you have a responsibility and obligation to go save someone's life according to Jewish law. Secular law says live and let live. If you do it, you're a good Samaritan and there'll be laws to protect you. You don't have to. Jewish law says you do have an obligation. And by not doing so, it would be lo samar adam re'acha. Question is, do you have to risk your life? That is the question. And this is something the Gemara discusses that I want to present in the next 10 minutes before we conclude for lunch today. Here's the thing. The Gemara rules, this is brought in the Shulchan Aruch. The Jerusalem Talmud Yerushalmi rules that one is obligated to rescue and even to put yourself in possible danger. Now, let me just be clear. There's a difference between possible danger and definite danger. Just so you understand. Therefore, the Shulchan Aruch says it appears that you are to put your life at danger. The reason is that the person will certainly die if he's not rescued. Whereas regarding yourself, bari v'shema bari adif. You know what that means? Where there's a potential and a for certain, the for certain takes precedence. So, will this guy Avi, who jumped into the water, I told the story a long time ago because I don't remember all the names, but there was a guy, Avi Weiss, maybe, I don't remember his names. Okay? Avi jumps into the water to save the life of this Israeli girl on the boat. Avi could have a calculation. Were there people who died of the water contamination? Yes. Will I for sure die if I jump into that water? Maybe, maybe not. Will she for sure die if she's unconscious now? I don't know if she hit something, whatever the story was. Will she for sure die if nobody rescues her? Yes. That's Bari B'Shema, Bari Adif. Bari is for sure she will die if I don't rescue her. I might die if I rescue her. So which takes precedence? Says the Shulchan Aruch, very straightforward. A certainty outweighs a doubt. As long as one is only putting themselves in potential danger, potentially dangerous, potentially die, then the Shulchan Aruch rules, I have an obligation and a responsibility to save someone else's life from certain death. Because of their case, they will for sure die. Says the Gemara, Rav Imi was captured by bandits and he was in great danger. Now, when this news was heard, and believing that Rav Imi's death was already foregone, Rabbi Yochanan said, let the dead be wrapped in his burial shroud, in his tachrichim. You hear this? So where they thought, there was a debate between two rabbis. Somebody was captured. Do we risk our life to try to save him? One of the rabbis said, Rabbi Yochanan said, he's already dead. We ain't going in. Reish Lakish on the other hand said, either I will kill the bandits or I will be killed, but I will go and fight. You can see a different approach here. Reish Lakish is willing to put his life at risk. Okay, and the Gemara says that he actually was successful in rescuing his colleague by a physical confrontation. Now, something very interesting, if you know who Reish Lakish was. He was a rabbi. He was a rabbi in Israel, but he was a Baal Teshuvah. How did he live his life before he became a rabbi? He was a thief. He was a bandit. He knew how to fight. So you see there's a difference between somebody who knows how to fight and somebody who doesn't know how to fight. Reish Lakish says, I will go, and either I will be killed by the bandits or I will kill them, but I'm willing to put my life at risk. There's a difference. He's trained. He's carrying a gun. He knows how to fight with them. So, although he succeeded in rescuing his colleague, he was clearly prepared to accept that risk. But nevertheless, remember that he had a mechanism of fighting. He was trained at fighting. He came from a background of fighters. So it's important to put everything into context. And the law says that Bari V'Shema Bari Adif, in a case where we know for sure they'd be dead, and in a case where it's maybe. So here you have another risk factor. I understand why Reish Lakish could put his life at risk. What about Rabbi Yochanan? He didn't know how to fight. What He didn't want to take responsibility of risking anyone else. It's a very interesting perspective that has to be taken into consideration of the rule. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We'll get back to her in a moment.
Because I'm not confused from what you just said. Because the case was amazing.
Exactly. And that's why, in her theory was, I'm putting my life at risk. Therefore, I shouldn't go. Mordechai is saying, but you maybe you can go. Maybe Achashverosh will extend his scepter to you. Maybe he won't. But what about us? We're already for sure being exterminated. Bari v'shema, bari adif. Therefore, you go and risk your life because maybe you'll find favor. Maybe you won't. So it seems that the law is saying that when it comes to putting your life at risk, do you or don't you? Well, the halacha is saying that if you might die, you have no obligation. And therefore, apply that to Esther. I might die, I have no obligation. But if we are going to put it into the other perspective, where the rescuer will survive, then they do have an obligation. Aha. So which way do we see this? And there's a lot in the Gemara, and I won't have a chance to go through all of it, but the Gemara says where the victim will definitely die and the rescuer might die. What is the halacha in that case? You have no obligation to risk your life, right? If you have no obligation to risk your life, Esther's going to die, then the Torah says, V'chai b'hem, very good. Then you have no obligation to go in. And that's perhaps why Esther is thinking that she shouldn't have to. Brian? All right. Okay. Just ladies and gents, just to be aware that we are on Zoom and YouTube, and better that everyone it's fine. Okay. I'm just trying to think. I want to fast forward here and where to conclude. I want to fast forward into. Okay, let's fast forward. The notion that divine duty is predicated on the preservation of our life is actually something that we see in the story of the Exodus. Let's go there for a moment. When Hashem spoke to Moshe at the burning bush for the very first time, and Hashem called upon him to liberate the Jewish people from Egypt. We're going into Pesach. Next week, we're going to go into the mode of preparing for Pesach. So already in there. Hashem adds a few words to listen to these words. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe. God spoke to Moshe when he was speaking to him in Midian and says, Lech shuv Mitzrayim. Moses, you go return to Egypt. Because all the people who sought your life, remember when Moshe, oppressive Egyptian taskmaster in defense of a Jewish slave, what happened? Moshe escaped the land of Egypt to avoid his death sentence. So before sending Moshe back off to his mission, to go confront Pharaoh, God reassures him that he won't be coming into a state of danger of returning to Egypt. Those are the words God says. Hashem reassures. Hashem says there's no risk to your life. So the thing is that our sages learned from this story that if Moses would be in danger, the fact that God is telling him, Meisu kol anashim, that all those people who hamavakshim es nafshecha, who are seeking your decapitation, those people are dead. You don't have to worry. The fact that verse, that Hashem says that to him, what does that indicate? That maybe Moshe would not be expected to actually go back to Egypt if his own life was at risk. Okay? So from this story, it's evident that if those people were aware that Moshe is still around and Moshe would be risking his life, then maybe Moshe would not be obligated to risk his own life to go back. And therefore, there's differences of opinion in this matter that's discussed in the Talmud, whether Moshe would have an obligation to go back to Egypt, and the fact that God reassures him at the burning bush means that one does not have to risk their life. So if we're to deduce from this story, let's go back to Esther and see how that goes. Why does God want Esther? Why is Esther being pushed by Mordechai to go? What's that? Well, if Esther's hesitation was founded on this halachic ethical debate, this consideration that we have discussed today, that yes, you have a responsibility to save a life, but not if it means risking your own. The Mordechai's answer, that Mordechai says, what does Mordechai say? Don't imagine that you yourself will escape if we'll all be exterminated. Okay? So maybe she has no obligation to risk her life, just like Moshe Rabbeinu in the story that we see. Yet Mordechai still says, if you don't go, then you'll perish. Yeah. Oh, so now we have to put everything into perspective, because every situation is what's going to happen. Like you're saying, if you don't go, you're going to die anyways. Because like the Jews in Germany so many years later, everyone was at risk, right? Says the Vilna Gaon that Mordechai was telling Esther that you'll be killed even if you don't go. Therefore, in this case, you have to go anyways. So this decree against the Jews, Mordechai is telling Esther, is on all Jewish people, you yourself included. Now, it might seem as though you might be able to stand clear of this whole impending destruction because you are in this privileged position, you live in the palace, but it's for all Jews. So as dangerous as calling on the king uninvited was, it would have a risk that Esther was taking to save herself as well, because she is part of the Jewish people, and she too, right? So from this whole story is that Esther's concerns were not motivated by, she wasn't, it's not just about her, she thought maybe there's time. Mordechai's saying there's no time. Mordechai's saying there's no time here. You better go now, because now you are being called upon to go immediately. And the halacha is, yes, exactly. This is something the Rebbe spoke about in this inner dimension of the Mordechai and Esther dialogue that infuses it with a rich layer of meaning. In response to Esther saying that maybe I shouldn't go, maybe there's time, maybe I could buy, maybe there's a halachic reason. Mordechai went beyond answering just the halachic terms. His answer was that now is the time for, now's not the time for conventional rules. The fact that an extraordinary series of events ultimately placed a Jewish queen at the very heart of the royal Persian palace, precisely at the time that the Jewish people were confronted with an unprecedented existential threat, that had an unmistakable, there was an obvious lesson here that the natural order was suspended, the rules had changed. Just think about Esther's dramatic ascension to the throne, that Esther herself was in this position where she was capable of saving the whole of world Jewry. Well, that's where she realizes. She says that if I don't go, I realize I will perish too. right? Because we're all part of this. And therefore, if I do go and I'll perish, at least I know that I tried. And that's the point. Just think about it. I don't know, trying to think of a modern example. But the point is that a person has to be willing. We all have to realize we're all in this together. And that, I think, is the message. Yeah. Yeah.
The rabbi that left Ukraine to take his family to America and he returned.
Yes. Exactly. Very good. Thank you. And the point was, when Esther comes to the king, remember what she says. I am part of these people. Okay? So I am part of these people. And therefore, if I am part of these people, I too, your wife, am also at risk and vulnerable of being murdered by this man's terrible plan. And therefore, she's able to convince the king to realize and to see the mistake in allowing this to happen. And therefore, Mordechai says, Im la'es kazois, it's for this time that you are here. Carpe diem, time to act. And we have to realize for us as well, we all have eit lasot. We all have our responsibilities. Carpe diem. Chaparain. So we have to realize that the hand of divine destiny guides each and every single one of us. Just as Esther ended up in a totally unexpected environment. She didn't expect to be the person who would be the queen. But the message is, we all find ourselves in situations and positions. And if we are there, exactly. So whenever someone is presented with an opportunity to help others, we have to remember what Mordechai said to Esther. It's for this time that you were put in this place. Why am I here in this world? When I was a kid, we would sing a song. For 70, 80 years, a neshama wears and tears, just to do a favor for another. What are we here for? The Baal Shem Tov taught us. Every one of us is here in this world to make a difference. We all are here on a divine mission and purpose. And therefore, we have to remember, what am I here for? What difference can I make? Each one of us, like in the halachic discussion, like in the Kitty Genovese case, don't just be a bystander. Don't just say, I'm not interfering. I'm not my brother's keeper. We all can make a difference. And that is the message and lesson for us today and every day. Absolutely. Ladies and gents, big yeshikach. Tomorrow, please God, Miriam will be presenting the Purim story in... Okay, surprise. Monday is a fast day. It's the fast of Esther. We will still have a shiur on Monday, even though it is a fast day. So we'll have a fast shiur. We will have a shiur on Monday, please God, and we will have lunch for those who are not fasting. Okay, if you're fasting, then don't eat the lunch. If you're not fasting, you're still welcome to eat the lunch. On Tuesday, we will just have Megillah and party here, 11:30 in, you'll see where, but most likely in the bracha room. On Wednesday, I might have to go somewhere Wednesday. If I can't give the shiur, I will offer it to Esther, to Miriam. And if Miriam can't give the shiur, then I will try to get another person to give the shiur. So just to let you know, I might have to go somewhere, but we will continue then after Purim with the Pesach series. For 3 weeks, we will look at lessons and messages relating to Pesach. Yeah.
You forgot to mention, as far as I'm aware, that Monday, Cynthia will be doing.
Yes, she will do a memory class in the morning. And Kim will still do her art class. Yes. Thank you.